Who's actually running the government if we've got civil servants able to bring an end to cases of this significance for the United Kingdom national security?
It's the story that's on the front of today's Sunday Times, and it delves into just why charges were dropped against those two men accused of spying for China from inside the UK Parliament. You'll remember the story. 30-year-old Chris Cash and 33-year-old Christopher Berry were charged in April 2024 after an investigation by Scotland Yard's counter-terrorism officers. Their trial was due to start tomorrow, so that's why this story is very timely. The dropping of those charges before the two men's trial fueled suspicions that it was done to placate the Chinese, basically, ahead of a trade visit by UK government ministers. Well, the Sunday Times today, you'll know if you've seen the story. If you haven't, please read it. It's great, thetimes.com. The Sunday Times has learned that the government's national security advisor, Jonathan Powell, said the government's evidence would be based on a new document that stopped short of calling China hostile. In other words, the whole case that these civil servants were allegedly working for an enemy wouldn't stand up because the government doesn't consider China an enemy. Here's what Shadow Home Secretary Chris Philp thought about that on Times Radio earlier.
If that is true, then the government has caused a prosecution for spying to collapse. The spying was being done against members of parliament. The government has caused, in my view, that case to collapse because the government is prioritising economic links with China and kowtowing to China above our national security.
Well, the Cabinet Office says the decision not to proceed with the prosecution was made independent of government. It doesn't recognise the meeting as described in today's paper. Here's the Home Secretary, Shabana Mahmood, also speaking to Times Radio today.
We were very disappointed in the Home Office to see the prosecution dropped. My understanding is that the evidence that brought the prosecution in the first place, there was no material change in the initial evidence and the evidence that would have gone to trial. So I do think it is a matter for the Crown Prosecution Service rightly to respond to.
Well, Luke de Pulford is the co-founder of the Interparliamentary Alliance on China and joins me again. Hello, Luke.
Hi.
Hi, good to speak to you again. When I actually went straight to your tweets today to see how you've responded to this, and I noticed that when you linked to the Sunday Times piece, you kind of asterisked the words civil servants. Is that the biggest revelation for you, that civil servants were perhaps part of this process, and that's what we've learned today?
Yeah, this is the weirdness, because when the Security Minister, Dan Jarvis, came to the House a few weeks ago, he said no ministers were involved in this decision. And Dan Jarvis is not a man, I believe, to lie to the House of Commons, which begs the question, well, who then made the decision that collapsed this case? We've now learned today, I think in the Sunday Times, how it happened, which is a very nuanced process which led to the collapse of this case, overseen by civil servants and a government special advisor, that's Jonathan Powell. So yes, I think that's the important thing to take away from this. I mean, who's actually running the government if we've got civil servants able to bring an end to cases of this significance for the United Kingdom national security?
Is it not just a matter, though, of process, that if there's an official report, because the word came from their national security strategy, it's a bit complicated this, but the word that suggested that China is not an enemy was from that report. So isn't it just a matter of process for a civil servant to say, look, you can give evidence, but if you give evidence, you have to refer to our official reports, and our official reports does not consider China an enemy, and therefore this allegation does not involve an enemy?
No, I don't think so, because my understanding is that there was not a request to include the Home Office's threat assessments of China in the evidence given by the Deputy National Security Advisor. So that would exclude everything that MI5 and anything that the Home Office has responsibility for has gleaned about China's behaviour in the UK, which, by the way, is frankly most of the evidence around China's malign influence in the UK, its influence operations, its interference operations. So that would have been excluded from the Deputy National Security Advisor's evidence. That's obviously very, very significant. So it's not just a question of this is in line with our policy on China. It's a question of, well, what do our agencies actually think about China? And we know what they think, because Ken McCullum has said this with the FBI director, on many occasions, China represents our biggest security threat. So if that's the case, absolutely their evidence should have been included. And I believe they could have got to the evidentiary threshold to label China an enemy for the purposes of the Official Secrets Act.
But I mean, we heard this from the Home Secretary we clipped up earlier. There's a sense of saying, the government saying, well, it was up to the CPS to put together a better case than having one star witness who wasn't able to say what they needed them to say. There should have been more evidence if you need to stand it up in court.
No, I think the finger pointing at the CPS is totally unjustified. It's not down to the Crown Prosecution Service to determine who is or is not an enemy state to the United Kingdom. That's clearly a matter for government. They shouldn't be pointing the finger at the DPP or the CPS over that. Their job is to work on the basis of the evidence that they've been provided by government. And the evidence they were provided by government was clearly insufficient to determine that China was an enemy for the purposes of the legislation needed to prosecute this case. That's why it was collapsed. They did not provide the evidence needed to get to that threshold. That's why it happened. And that is not the fault of the DPP. That's the fault of the government. And it seems the fault of these civil servants and this special advisor.
Okay. Whilst I've got you here, Luke, because, you know, you are an expert on this and it's good to provide a little bit more context, I think. What is the threat posed by China? If it is true that they have spies all over Westminster, if it is true that they are hacking into our data, that they are gathering information to use against us, what is the real, tangible, detrimental impact on our country that could happen?
Well, look, China's interference, its influence activities in the United Kingdom can't easily be summarized because they are so broad. There's a reason that the head of our domestic intelligence services is saying that China represents the biggest threat. And the threat would be not just in data collection on the United Kingdom, but principally focuses on changing the way that our institutions function to make them more receptive to the foreign policy of the Communist Party of China. That's the idea. So it's in changing the way that our institutions function, in influencing them, in ensuring that there is less opposition and less resistance to the aims of the CCP. And that's a very significant influence. I mean, one particular node for that is the work of the United Front, which you would have heard about before because it's been reported very extensively in the Times and Sunday Times. This is a very nefarious influence, an overseas influence arm of the CCP. So there are many, many ways in which that influence plays out in the UK. They are detrimental to our security interests and very beneficial to the foreign policy interests of Xi Jinping and his cronies. And that's not a situation that we should allow to just pass unremarked, and certainly not one that we should aid and abet by failing to prosecute key national security cases like this.
I suppose it's hard, though, isn't it, for the public to put the pieces together and say, OK, well, this is a potential threat that was exposed that could lead to the kind of implications that you're discussing. The bits in between those two positions are quite hard to piece together if you're not part of your world, if you don't know how espionage works. How would, intelligence gathered from the backroom office of a Tory MP be used to threaten our country? And I don't just mean in this alleged case, I mean just in general. Like, what would the threat be?
Okay, so let's talk through it. The allegation in this case is an allegation from the CPS, was that 34 reports were compiled and basically found their way into the Politburo of the Communist Party of China. Now, what could that mean? Well, it would mean that they would be furnished with an insider understanding of, let's say, China's skeptical thought within the UK Parliament. So if you were invested in some way in trying to change the way that China's skepticism was happening in the United Kingdom, you'd be able to do that based upon that intelligence, or at least you'd have a better shot at it. And judging from some of the money that was flowing around and being donated to various members of Parliament, and also the divisions that I think that we saw within, let's call it the sort of China hawk parliamentary community, it could have been that that information was very influential and had a bearing on debates on China over the past few years. This is not negligible stuff.
And the decision on whether to approve the so-called mega embassy, that's a news story that's been sort of floating about for years, isn't it? But I understand there is a decision expected within weeks. Do you think that has a role to play in the way the government are responding to this Sunday Times story today?
I'm not sure it does. I don't think it's connected. I think it's much more likely that this story is connected to the UK's ongoing economic and financial dialogue with China, which you will remember was restarted after it was paused in 2020 because of the national security law being imposed upon Hong Kong. This was the closest that the UK came to holding China accountable for that. They paused the economic and financial dialogue. Well, now they've restarted that. And the UK is in a desperate economic place, so it doesn't want to upset China. And I think that's why we've ended up in this situation with these cases. But, you know, the broader picture around this is that the UK's posture towards China has been weakening. And it's been weakening because we've seen the treasurization of UK politics. The Treasury running the show and wanting to make sure that sort of begging bowl Britain is able to get everything from China that it possibly can. I think that explains much more about the current posture and the decisions in this case than anything else. Certainly not the embassy, which, you know, a decision on that has to be made by the 21st of October. But honestly, I think the government is under such diplomatic pressure from China over that it's likely they will have to green light it, and even more likely that they will be judicially reviewed when they do.
Okay. Thank you. Can I just ask you more prosaically where you are? Because I can see some palm trees behind you, but it doesn't look like Britain.
I'm not in the United Kingdom, but
Okay.
if I tell you that, then it might wing its way into some of these reports that we don't want to see.
Fair enough. Well, I can reveal that you're somewhere where the weather looks nicer than here. So thank you for taking some time out to speak to us. Luke de Pulford there. Cheers. Co-founder of the Interparliamentary Alliance on China.